One thing that's very hard to conceptualize for a lot of people who live in the West is the sheer surveillance state that exists in Xinjiang, and that the Uyghur people and other minorities like Tibet, Mongolians, and other minorities in China are subjected to. But I would say predominantly the Uyghurs is just staggering to even understand.
Hey there, welcome to Cancel This. I'm your host, Angelo Isidoro, and today we're going to be speaking to Jake Reznik. Jake is an activist against the CCP, that's the Chinese Communist Party of China, and he is a speaker who focuses on the plight of the Uyghur people. That is the Muslim minority in central China. They are currently going through a genocide. Well, some would call it a genocide. That's obviously disputed. And he has a lot to say on the matter. He's someone I consider to be an expert and a friend. So I think you're going to learn a lot. I certainly learned a lot from the conversation on what exactly is going on with China and why we should maybe not be trading with them or doing any sort of business with them. Please give it a listen and let me know your thoughts. All right, Jake, welcome to Cancel This. It must be a really big honor for you to be on my podcast.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you for having me. It's always something I've wanted to do, and I'm glad we can finally make it happen where our schedules work out.
Perfect. So you are an activist. Obviously, we know each other. We've worked together in free speech activism, but lately what you've been doing is primarily focused on China and the Uyghur population and just overall the awfulness that is the Chinese communist regime. I don't know enough about it. I don't think the world knows enough about it. You've gotten to a point where you're like speaking at events about it and you're like this spokesperson, and you're not exactly, when I think of an oppressed Chinese person, you're not exactly what comes to mind, just even visually. So tell me why this cause is so important for you.
Oh, that's a really big, deep question, and I can definitely just go straight to the point, and then we can kind of expand from it. But I would say what's happening in China right now, specifically in Western China, with the Uyghur people, is so morally abhorrent. And as a Jew whose family has suffered under tyranny, specifically in the Second World War and during the Holocaust, I think it's almost like a moral imperative for me and for wider society to speak out against what's happening, because I'm a big believer in the idea of never again means not just words, it means action. And right now we have so much information leaking out of China through satellite imagery, through leaks from government documents, and through testimonies from Uyghur people themselves about just the sheer scale and of the atrocities happening. And just because it's happening to a people that is far away on another continent does not mean that we can't speak out here. And it doesn't mean that we can't take steps in Canada, in the United States, or wherever the listeners are to essentially be a voice for the voiceless. Because the way China functions is there's just so much censorship, and the government will not allow Uyghur people and minorities to speak out. So it's honestly just something we have to do, and it's something that we can do, and something I'm really proud of doing. I should also mention I'm a part of an organization called Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom, and we're basically Jewish activists from across North America who want to show solidarity and action with the Uyghur people, and hopefully sooner rather than later, the actions that from everyone can create the positive change that we all seek.
Well, I think, a large part of how this sort of affected me just on an emotional level, and obviously it affects you on an emotional level, is the denialism of it. Because obviously your family has been, through the terrors and genocides of the 20th century, as has mine. My family went through the Armenian genocide, which, as you know, is widely denied in Turkey. The other day, we just had the anniversary day for the Holodomor, which is also highly denied by academic communists, and I believe even Russia denies the Holodomor. So there is an issue of genocide denialism when it comes to the terrors of the 20th century, and China is essentially denying that this is happening to the Uyghurs. So, I mean, how much does that sort of raise your morale in terms of the need to do this? Is the fact that it is reported on so little that you feel the need to have a bullhorn on it?
I will say two things. First thing is that for a while, China denied that it was even doing any sort of the concentration camps, or as they like to call it, the vocational education centers. But then they started framing it as what I just mentioned, as education centers, as a way to like liberate the Uyghur people out of poverty. But one thing that's really important, I think, to emphasize to the listeners and to you as well, is that this isn't a new issue, the Uyghur genocide and what's happening in Xinjiang or East Turkestan. It's just escalated far more under Xi Jinping than other past Chinese dictators. So, like, I can give you an example. In 1915, around 65% of the population of Xinjiang was ethnically Uyghur. And right now, it's under 50%. And the Han Chinese population has risen from around 6% to over 40%. This isn't an accident. This isn't natural migration. The Chinese government incentivizes Han Chinese people to move to the area, as well as they have a lot of different streams of what I would call a cultural genocide, such as not allowing Uyghur people to go to mosques, not allowing them to, for example, wear long beards or exhibit any sort of like Islamic faith. Coupled that with the fact of their mass sterilization program and obviously what's happening in the concentration camps, all these little tactics that the Chinese government uses, what it's essentially doing is causing the birth rates of the Uyghur people to plummet. And one thing that's, I think, really important to recognize is you don't have to commit a genocide by killing people. That's obviously the fastest way, but given the world that we exist in right now, it's not necessarily the most palatable way. The more, I don't know what you just want to say, easier, but the reality of what China's doing is essentially it's preventing Uyghurs from being born. And this is also coupled with the fact that a lot of Uyghur women will be married off to Han Chinese men, as I'm sure we all know that there's a huge gender disparity in China between men and women. Also, a lot of the young men of Uyghur descent will be moved out from China, moved into factories, moved into, I would say, very like labor work, like cleaners, and not the most pleasant of work outside of Xinjiang. So all these different things come together to almost create this like perfect recipe that China is doing right now and has been doing for a long time to essentially rid the area of the Uyghur people. And one thing I will mention is a lot of people ask, why are they doing this? It's important to remember that like the area that the Uyghur people live in, Xinjiang, it's rich in coal, natural gas, natural resources, rare earth elements. It's a very large area with a lot of potential natural resources that China can sell to the world. And obviously they don't want any sort of like separatist movements happening from there. So, but to get back to your question with denialism, it's pretty hard to deny everything. And as much as China and the Chinese government will try to put on a face, it's already out there. And I think that it doesn't take anyone to go too deep to realize the sheer scale and the devastation that's happening.
And it's really not only exclusive to the Uyghurs. I wrote a piece recently that that talked about the fact that a lot of Tibetan people are also being sent off to these labor camps. So it is, I imagine a large part of it is a fear from the Chinese Communist Party that in reality, China isn't, it's not held together so tightly as much as we think. And it does have potential for fragmentation. So I think that is surely one of their fears. But getting to the genocide part of it, I think you raise a good point, which is that genocide is not always acute in the sense that people hate a group of people and they just murder them one day and they're all gone. It does seem to be a gradual dehumanization. It can start with something as simple as censoring a certain group, and then that could lead exponentially to mandating a certain symbol to be worn on their sleeve. I mean, again, this is something that we've seen happen time and time again. It happened in Poland, And it happened in Micronesia with, it happened in Poland with your family. It happened in Micronesia with my family, where you're part of a society that gradually begins to hate you more and more, gradually begins to make you more of an other. They other you to such a point where they successfully brainwash their own population into believing that you're cattle. And that is when the actual death begins to ensue. I think, do you think that this will reach a point where it is just firing squads? Do you think it will get to that point where they do just round up groups of people and shoot them and throw them in a mass grave? Or do you feel that it's too difficult to do that in the modern day with the media?
I'll say to that specific question, I don't think they even need to do that. If they just keep people in camps and do all the tactics that I've just previously described and so much more, they don't even need to kill them. They can just use them as like slave labor, like they're doing in a lot of the factories. It's more efficient and more, in a sense, it's the Chinese Communist Party's desire to use them as labor and use them as cheap work and as free work than to just kill them, which I would say in some ways even maybe more heinous on their part. And just to go back on the point you just mentioned about othering, I think one thing that's very hard to conceptualize for a lot of people who live in the West is the sheer surveillance state that exists in Xinjiang, and that the Uyghur people and other minorities like Tibet, Mongolians and other minorities in China are subjected to, but I'd say predominantly the Uyghurs, is just staggering to even understand. Like, I can give you a very simple example. If you want to buy a knife, they will put a barcode into that knife, like etch it in, and that knife will forever be linked to the person who bought it. So in the event that that knife is ever used in some sort of attack against a Chinese official or a crime or whatever, it can instantly be linked back to the person that bought them. And it goes so much more deeper than just that. I found that just interesting, such as like checkpoints. They'll have separate doors and separate entrances for Han Chinese and Uyghur people. They'll have checkpoints on almost every 4 blocks or so. And a lot of like companies like Huawei and a whole bunch of these like Chinese tech firms are essentially maximizing all of the technology that they can just pump into Xinjiang, because there's obviously no regulations, no rules, and they're allowed to almost experiment with everything from like AI to almost anything, where it's like they're at the point where they can scan someone's face and just tell what mood they're in and predict a likelihood of their chance of committing a terrorist attack. Couple that with the fact of the social credit system that exists in China, and we can go into that if you want. All of these things come together to make this almost like dystopian police state that exists, and we know about it, yet somehow we're powerless to act because we want China's market.
Yeah, well, essentially, I mean, not only do we know about it, but some of our corporations actively take part. I mean, the new Mulan movie, I think, was filmed in the same province where they have basically slave labor. We know the NBA won't dare say a negative thing about China. So we've entered into this weird form where it's communist China. They are a communist nation, but you also have capitalist organizations in the West that, salivate at the idea of having 1 billion people to market to, and having, a market that promotes slave labor or labor that is child labor, that, people get paid 2 cents a day. And it's to such a degree where they even have like suicide nets in some of these factories in China. So it's a whole other world. And not only do we know about it, but we're propagating it. So to that end, what should the West do in regard to this? Are we making the mistake that we've made in the past of ignoring the strongman country that is oppressing a group of people until it affects us, whether that was Nazi Germany, whether that was the Soviet Union with Ukraine, or the Ottoman Empire with Turkey? I mean, do we need to do something now?
I'd say, like, to that question and to that comment is more so that the reality is always money unfortunately trumps morality, and that's kind of what we're happening. We're having a vacuum of morality where, for example, I'm sure you've covered it in on Post Millennial as well, where they've had there was a recent talk about free Meng Wanzhou, and I listened to the conversation. There was actually a Green MP at that talk, and one of the most nauseating things was how the speakers and the panelists were talking about how China provides such an economic opportunity for Canada, how so many students come from China to Canada and bring us their money, and how China can bring jobs and trade and everything. And I understand in a vacuum that's great, but it's the fact that you're kind of only showing one side of it, which is the money side, and not the moral side of it. I think that just kind of shows how desensitized even we are to, and the people in Canada and the United States and in the West, of what's happening. In terms of what can be done, I'll go back and then go forward for a second. Is I think right now what Canada is doing in a lot of the West in terms of cooperating with China is essentially dealing with like Volkswagen from the 1930s. We're not at that violent stage yet, and I don't know if we'll even get there, but clearly there's something very morally abhorrent with what we're doing. I know in Canada specifically, there's a lot of talks about like banning Huawei, and in America there was like conversations with like banning TikTok, and all these things are like okay, but they don't really move the needle that much because China has such a deep tie to our economic system and in terms of everything, so much of what we do here, that it's just not enough. And we kind of allowed ourselves, specifically in the West, to allow China to be the main manufacturer of the world. And it's allowed China, for example, and it's been both in America, Democrats and Republicans, and in Canada, liberals and conservatives who've done this, who've allowed China to open ties. Like I think Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the first one to open up diplomatic ties with China. So it sucks. It's really unfortunate when you see how much money can influence our politics, influence our culture, influence our society. I can give you another example of, there's like, as you may have heard, there's things called Confucius Institutes, which promote Chinese language and Chinese culture. And there's some here in Vancouver as well, which are great on their own. And I have nothing but appreciation for Chinese culture and everything. But a lot of these are just arms of the Chinese Communist Party. But the fact that we can't stand up to this and there isn't a mass movement around it, it just kind of shows how morally depraved a lot of our citizenry and our kind of society is, which is very sad and unfortunate.
Yeah, and I mean, there's instances of what you're talking about where it's gone further. In Australia, for example, there's one activist who's similarly to you, an anti-China, anti-CCP activist, who was actually thrown out of his university for speaking out against China. His name's Drew Pavlou. So it's gotten to that level in some areas. But I think, just going back to what you were talking about money and about the morals, essentially the moral imperative gets tossed out the window for money. Do you think that something like CANZUK is a good solution, where you have countries like Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia basically coming together to form an alliance of trade and basically stating that we are going to have a system of ethical capitalism where there is capitalism, but we will not negotiate or trade with countries that do not have the same human rights or development level as countries like, the UK and Canada, which are very similar, not only in the parliamentary system, but in development, in unions and systems and wages. Do you think we basically need to just say, we're not doing business with you anymore, full stop?
One thing, I'll say a few things. I think that first off, we have to realize that Canada, United States, and all these places are not perfect, but obviously we're not comparing them to the scale of human rights abuses that happen in China. And one thing I will mention is I think that our coalition against the Chinese Communist Party can actually be a lot more broader than just CANZUK. For example, whenever I go to the rallies we have in downtown, it's always a pleasure to see, for example, people from India, people from Japan, people from Korea, people from the Philippines, people who are against what China's doing in the South China Sea specifically. We can go far beyond that as well. It's just unfortunately China's money is so big, and it's going to be soon in in the 2020s, if not the 2030s. It should surpass the United States by a lot of metrics in terms of the world's largest economy. It's definitely a step, and building international coalitions is without a doubt something that can move the needle much more than like boycotts or sanctions. What I will say is when Nazi Germany was rising, there were boycotts, there were sanctions, but that didn't stop it. And boycotts and sanctions and international coalitions are a start, but the League of Nations failed. And what will happen with China, it's very hard to say because China is very unpredictable. There were a lot of people, specifically in like the 80s, who didn't think that China was an issue whatsoever. And that's why, for example, in part, Richard Nixon in the 70s invited it and established relations because no one thought China would get to this point. People thought that the Chinese Communist Party would fall, similar to like the Soviet Union and other regimes throughout the world. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say, but it definitely is better for us to stand together against the atrocities and the devastation happening in China, for sure.
Well, and I think a lot of people who are more globalist-minded thought that, well, maybe if we just McDonald's China the way we did with the Soviet Union, they're going to have a real taste for Western democracy, and that's how we're going to export democracy, is just by virtue of the fact that they're going to want it. I think the CCP was smarter than those other countries that we exported our freedom to, in the sense that they basically took our trade and took our strategy of sending businesses there and turned it against us. I mean, you say people didn't recognize China as a threat in the 80s. I think a lot of politicians don't now. I think we keep hearing, this narrative about Russia, 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 but you and I both know Russia's not a very powerful country. Even economically compared to China. So, it definitely raises the question of, do we realize the threat? And it's concerning to me that seemingly it's the liberal class and the left wing that is friendlier to China. And I say that, not with reservation, because the Prime Minister said that he admires the basic dictatorship and efficiency of China. And you did have that event where an NDP MP was invited, the Green MP was invited to free the Huawei CEO. I think it's very strange to me that the group or the political aisle that espouses human rights is not attacking China, and somehow the right wing, which is supposed to be the mustache twirling CEO political aisle, is seemingly more vocal against China. I mean, do you think that this is going to become a more political and partisan issue in Canada?
I think I want to go back to 1 second. I think one thing that people fail to realize about China is China is just emerging about 50 years outside of what they call the center of humiliation. Prior to around 1850 or so, China was a world superpower. We just didn't realize it because our minds are very like Eurocentric and Western-centric, but China has always been a domineering force in Asia and across the world, and has been the world's largest, one of the world's largest trading partners and economies. We just don't hear about like it, and we don't learn about, for example, Chinese imperialism. I'll make one more point, then I'll answer your question. I think if you look at the history of China, it's always been a history of dynasties rising, growing, collapsing, and falling and going again. That's how it's always been. I don't think democracy has never really existed in China in the way that we understand it, and I don't particularly think it could. But I do think at some point in the future, the CCP will inevitably fall. Such as everything, nothing is guaranteed. Will that be tomorrow? Probably not. But in terms of what's happening in Canada, it is obviously very disappointing and honestly frustrating and nauseating and whatever adjective you want to use about MPs who are, I don't want to say they're on the China side, but they're definitely pulling a Chinese narrative, specifically at that event with Paul Manley and supposedly Nikki Ashton as well. But on the flip side, there is strong multi-partisan support across a lot of the parties, including the NDP, and the Liberals, for what's happening in China. For example, the recent subcommittee that released the report on the human rights abuses of the Uyghur people, that was predominantly chaired by Liberals. But in terms of your question about whether the issue of China will become more partisan over time, I would hope not. But that's a lot of the world is like that. Things just become one-sided. It would be extremely devastating for us and very unfortunate if that was the case. But I think that there are voices on the left, on the right, and everywhere who will speak out against what is happening. But I just think in part because this issue isn't very trendy. It doesn't get a lot of likes on social media. It won't get you a lot of clout with your friends. It's not something that's in the prevailing culture that is seen as cool. So that's partly why I think maybe it doesn't get the attention as it is, because it is truly halfway across the world and it doesn't seem to touch us right in front of us. But just because it's not in front of us right now doesn't mean in the future it won't be, and that doesn't mean we can't take steps in it right now.
Do you think, I mean, I want to ask you, because you know you're an expert on the subject and everything, is Joe Biden as the new president a greater threat to China than Trump was?
It's hard to say. I haven't looked too much at Joe Biden. I haven't been following too much. One thing I will say about Trump is that it was very good that he would speak out against it, even when he was campaigning. I think that Joe Biden at least has some sort of idea and understanding of China. Like, he's been in the United States political system for 50 years. He can't be oblivious to it. But will he actually take the necessary actions to deal with the issue? I wouldn't get my hopes up. Similar with Trump, he was great at talking, and the trade wars that he engaged with China was great to bring the issue to the forefront. But it's nowhere near good enough and nowhere near at the point where it will do anything substantial. So I think it's kind of like the American political machine. It just kind of keeps going, even if it's Trump or Biden. Money talks, and as we've talked about, obviously money in China are very much, I think about 25% or 30% of America's exports go to China, and I think even more come to America from China. When you have such close business ties, it very much limits what you're able to do. Because I'll give you an example. Let's say hypothetically, this is just a hypothetical. Let's say if all Chinese mainland students were banned from Canadian universities. I'm not advocating for that, but let's just say that that was a thing that happened. Our tuition would rise by maybe $20,000, $30,000. I think that the average person, despite, even if you tell them about the human rights abuses in China, it'd be very hard to dissuade them from not wanting to pay less tuition, especially if that's not within your financial flexibility. So on a grand scale, that's kind of what's happening in America and in the West and our societies, where the cost is almost too great for us to take the moral action that needs to be taken. And as I've said before, it's sad and it's a little heartbreaking for sure.
Well, and I think probably no politician or leader wants to be the one that pulls that trigger and just says we're done with China and deals with the short-term backlash of the prices rising and the economic turmoil. So I think it's easier to just kick the can down the road.
So it would be very hard to sell a political campaign on, I'm going to make your life more expensive, but the benefit of that will be the human rights and potentially the safety of other people halfway across the world. It's very hard to sell that where a lot of people, specifically in Canada and America, are living paycheck to paycheck. And it's hard to sell that. It's very hard to market that. And that's kind of why we're in this kind of status quo where China provides us with such an economic gain that we're almost kind of like trapped by it in a sense.
So where could people follow you and your shenanigans and your activism?
So I would definitely follow the Facebook page that I run with a whole bunch of other Jewish activists on Facebook. As I mentioned, we're organized across North America, and we do try to keep up. And it's called the Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom. As well as you can add me on Facebook, Jake Reznik. Just send me a message if you're adding me for that, because then I won't accept you. And I definitely say that a lot of another really good resource to follow up on this topic is the Uyghur Human Rights Project. It's an American NGO. It speaks out specifically on the Uyghur people, but as we've mentioned before, there are a lot of other minorities that are subjugated to China's tyranny, not just the Uyghur people. And hopefully with more people getting educated and more people informing themselves, that can progress us in a positive direction that we all want to see.
All right, let's leave it there. Jake Reznik, thank you very much. That was Jake Reznik. He is with the Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom. Please go support them, Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom. I think it's very important to showcase what is going on in the world, especially just a few days after the memorial or anniversary for the Holodomor. I think we can't deny history, and right now we're denying the present because these people are clearly being oppressed, and they're being oppressed by a tyrannical government. So it's important to do our own due diligence, and then, like Jake said, it's incumbent upon us to point out and call out what's going on. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share. If you're watching this, or rather listening to this, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please consider following us and telling your friends. It really helps a lot. Thank you so much. Until next time.